Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog. And tonight is an actual vlog. Every now and then I get struck by something, and it's from the inevitable feeling that you're watching things circle a drain. And it sounds fatalistic, and many people throughout my life, regardless of my political persuasion, have rightly called me fatalistic. Um, that's a fair accusation in many ways. Because I, in some ways, accept what is often branded as a conservative belief that there are limitations to what people can do, particularly if those limitations are things you don't want to look at and don't want to deal with and don't want to think about. And one of the things about any politicized milieu, and I'm going to go into what I mean by that more as a milieu, is that you really have a problem wanting to look at what you're doing, your own psychological motivations for what you're doing, what fulfillment you get out of it. And that's true for someone like me too. Like, I am rage addled. Um, it's not something that manifests actually in my daily life. It manifests online. It manifests in other ways. But it is true. People who've dealt with me online will know that I can become doggedly vicious at a moment's notice if I really think I believe in something. But a lot of what I'm rage addled about, and this might be a self-excuse if one is honest, is how we use our beliefs to protect our sense of self. And this has gotten worse during COVID-19 and our alienation, not better. It's gotten a lot worse. The profundity of the ability of people to live in their head, most people can't do it. Monks trained for years and years and years to do it. And a lot of them still go absolutely batty. Humans are not meant for isolation. It's something we have to build a tolerance to. It's like building a tolerance for poison. And yet, we also have trouble conceptualizing direct conflict and anxiety. And I'm a teacher. It's something I do. And it drives the motivations of a lot of my students to avoid conflict at any cost, and even to avoid direct interpersonal engagement, because interpersonal engagement has the possibility for conflict. It's a fact of life. Now, I think that is actually part of the way we interact with people. Why have podcasts become a particular form of media that a lot of people engage with? They're organic. They don't have a high gatekeeping function. I've talked a lot about this with John Michael Cologne, but there's something else to it. The apparent intimacy of a podcast. There's a reason why low production value podcasts, or seemingly low production value podcasts, are so valued, is because it makes it seem like there's not that much of a barrier between you and the person you're listening to. You know parts of their life. And I am just as guilty of this as anyone else. I am bad about, throwing out humanizing anecdotes from my past, even though they're also about how I've traveled the world as a working class person as a formerly working class person who knows, that they were privileged to get that job that allowed them to travel the world like that. Like, it wasn't my own doing. It wasn't my own merit. It was fucking luck. Okay? Yes, if I was totally incompetent, I couldn't have kept that job. But there's 1,000 other people who are just as competent as me. And that is always true. And that's true in this media sphere too. It's totally true in this media sphere too. There are 1,000 people who could talk at you just as profoundly as me. What you respond to is the pretense of honesty. When I say the pretense of honesty, I'm not saying that I'm deliberately fooling anyone. The person I'm most likely to fool is myself. you get into the, to use a terrible French term, the jouissance of action, the jouissance of education, the jouissance of anything, this ability to feel like you have influence. And what's weird about my particular place in the media, right, is I'm an old hat. I'm not particularly relevant. Let's be honest. Like, I've been doing this for 10 years. There are 1,000 younger, cooler, sexier people who you can go listen to other than me. And I don't even feel bad about that. Do I think they're more wise than me? Probably not. But then again, who the fuck knows? There's a certain amount of realism you have to take when you're a media personality if you don't want to blow smoke up your own butt. Right? And most people eventually do. They really eventually do. And it's very hard to deal with. And when I talk about like the parasocial, the reason why podcasts seem to have the ability to do is you can feel like you have a relationship with someone, and you also feel like you can demand of them. And I don't want to say real relationships aren't born on the internet, because that's false. It's absolutely false. But you must remember that relationships involve mutual exchange of intimacies. If they don't have those mutual exchange of intimacies, if they're not there, they're not actually relationships. And we build parasocial relationships all over the place, not just with podcasters. I mean, people used to do it with the fucking television, and they do it with people they know. All right. How many people do you think really could you depend on? And you probably don't know. All right. There are depressing study after depressing study that says, like, if you think they're not your friends, if you have any doubt, they're probably not. And that exacerbates our sense of alienation for one another. You know, and I've noticed that there's been a pushback on these concepts of alienation, that I'm told that they're useless. And what's funny about that is I actually mostly agree that Hegelianism is, you know, nonsense, right? And this is going to seem like a weird term for those who don't follow left culture, but that it's kind of a theological mysticism, that it seems rational to you really think about it. But the alienation part, the fact that we don't have communities to invest in, and thus we have to invest in ourselves, whether we want to or not, right? That was actually the point of Christopher Lash's The Culture of Narcissism. It was not a shaming book about how the boomers were narcissists, even though it was read that way. If you read his book, The Minimum Self, it was that yourself is dependent upon your relations to other people. And the less thick those relations are, the thinner your sense of self is. And to make up the gap, you have to do things to construct an identity. And our terror management is tied to, and you know, for those of you who know terror management theory, you can dig into this a little more. But our terror management is tied to the fact that we think that our ideologies will outlive us, because we know that ideologies of the past will outlive their owners. And it's kind of a way to survive, that part of you can survive. It's like having kids, right? Except it's intellectual. And in some ways, it's even more vague and further lasting, because your kids die. They may not have kids of their own, and your genetic line dies, right? And maybe you don't want kids, but your ideas can live on. That's what we always tell ourselves, that ideas are immortal. You know, poetry is immortal. You can go back to Shakespeare and watching these debates. Poetry is not immortal. Eventually the language goes to dust. I have an ethic personally, and we're going to get to how this ties into parasocialness eventually, but I have an ethic that is dependent upon both admitting that I have an ethic, not conflating the normative and descriptive so that I hide that I have an ethical commitment, but also realizing that the world does not give a shit about my ethical commitment. That my own justice cannot be projected upon the world. The world does not have moral values. It is an objective thing. It is not even one objective thing, actually. The concept of being a singular objective thing is something we project upon it. It is a cacophonous series of systems and discrete matter that works in concert that we project meaning upon. And that is terrifying. Right? It is terrifying to look at that honestly. Absolutely stripped you to the bone. And so we project onto our ideas our sense of self. That's why we defend our ideas more than we'll even sometimes defend our own lives. Because we see ourself in the ideas. Now, why is this important? And what does this have to do with parasociality? Well, the parasocial is a stand-in for the social. It's what it's supposed to do. And in some ways, even neurologically, it's a stand-in for the social. And it's unavoidable. We all do it. I can't tell you that because parasociality resists, I don't have parasocial relationships. All right? People fall in love parasocially. And from falling in love parasocially, occasionally it becomes truly social. The peer relationship is established. Right? This does happen. I had an English professor once. I'm not going to say his name, and I don't think he's still alive. He was an old hippie. But he's a cynical old hippie, burnt out from the 70s. And he once said, his wife was a psychiatrist, and he once said to me, in my entire class of 17-year-olds, we love those who justify our lies. And that never left me. It never left me because it's too cynical, but there's a partial truth to it. And that partial truth, if we're completely honest with ourselves, is that we love those who justify our lies because they validate our being. And we want to be validated. We want to be seen for who we are. But this is a fundamental trap. I was thinking about the history, how this relates to the history of politics. In almost every scenario, the first two generations of people realize the shit that they're saying is total bunkum. I was listening to Gore Vidal today. I shared it on Facebook if you want to find it, talking about how Truman and Eisenhower both were old cynical politicians and knew damn well that the Russians, that the Soviets were not really a threat at the point that they were at, that they were harking back to a time where the threat seemed real in the 1920s. But that John F. Kennedy was dumb enough to actually believe it, and to believe that the appearances actually mattered more than the physical reality. And the only reason we don't have to face this, socially in the United States, is that John F. Kennedy was martyred. And so we don't have to look at what he actually was doing. And that he was the person who drank the Kool-Aid. You see this with the cynicism around neoconservatism. You get the weird feeling that that George W. Bush actually believed the bullshit he said. Really, truly believed it. Yes, he was laughing at the evangelicals all the way to the bank. But as far as like freedom and liberty, he really believed it. And I talked to my friend Kuba, and he's always telling me, yes, a lot of the foreign policy military elites actually believe the shit they say, and that's actually a problem. But it's funny because almost no one ever does. And they always talk about, when Kuba was talking to me about Lenin and how, Lenin may or may not believed, but the world probably would have been better if Stalin really didn't. One of the things about true belief, when you conflate the normative and descriptive and confuse that with your identity, with your place in the world, with your projection beyond your meatbag self, is that you will defend those stupid ideas and every fucking stupid thing you've ever said because you're defending your own sense of self forever. And it's interesting, right? Because it puts us in a bind where we're all encouraged to be self-dishonest. How many times have people said to you, this must be true because it worked? All right, without looking at the fact that, in this case of, say, socialism, that if it worked, why did everything turn out the way it is right now? And then eventually they'll throw themselves into denying the reality is that it is seen. It is a self-gaslighting. There are few things more dangerous to your long-term survival than self-gaslighting. And yet it's one of the most common things humans do. And you would like for me to give you a nice pat Marxist answer, but I actually think that the answer is deeper than that, and maybe more basic to what human beings are, as confused monkeys who can abstractly project because we figured out the technology of language. Our structures, to back this up, in some ways limit our abilities to do anything about our world, but also limit our abilities to see those very structures, right? This is the whole structuralist paradigm. But the structuralists also somehow believe they're magically exempt from the problem of which they state. But why would they be? Why would they not also have a structural function that is already built into the system in which they are instantiating? And why does their materialism and the ideology not also function the same way? Is it just special pleading or wishful thinking? And I don't say this to lead you into despair. All right? I know people think that I get off on that, but I don't. You can waste your life spinning your wheels for something that you believe in, and that is impossible. And we see this with religion all the time, but we don't want to look at it with politics because we think they're fundamentally different processes. And they're absolutely not. I say this because in many ways I feel like I have not been as honest as I need to be. But how can you? All the incentives are wrong. And I don't say this as a self-excuse. I was thinking the other day how people ask me all the time for Left Unity to keep my critiques down. And I honestly really don't like attacking people personally unless I'm just fed up. And sometimes I get fed up when I go after people who don't deserve it, or maybe their ideas are wrong, but they don't deserve the way I'm treating them. And that's a real thing we all do. And some of us do it more than others. I don't want to spread out the blame so that there is no blame. But there's also a sense in which I know I've invested many times in my life in things that were stupid or hopeless, and I'm old enough to have invested years in them. And to wake up and to have to deal with the fact that how do you have integrity and stand for your principles when you have to admit you've been suckered and that maybe your principles were misguiding you because you conflated what you wanted to be true with what is true. It's a very hard thing to look at and process and think about. And I think about it in regards to myself. For many years, I was a paleoconservative. For many years, I was a Buddhist. All right. This shaved head I used to have for religious reasons. Now I just have it because I don't want to deal with my hair. And people come to me as if I'm some kind of font of wisdom because I'm smart and I've read a whole lot of things and I've been around the world and I have had a pretty hard life in my 20s. In particular. Or, well, my 30s kind of suck too. and you look around and you go, who's fighting for me? You know, who's fighting for me? And then you have the first shock of realization that you don't know who me is. I used to talk about the PMC thesis, right? The PMC thesis, Forrest from Give Them an Argument, the producer. Let me look up his last name because it's escaped me right now. I don't know. He mentioned that he thought that the PMC thesis people are like people who are like new atheists because they come out of something, they see the shock of their former selves and their own role in something, and then denounce everything and then hide behind it. Now, some of it, I think he's being too charitable, but there are people. Yeah, Forrest Miller. There are people who that is true for. Like, I think Catherine Liu, to be charitable to her, woke up and was like, well, there was this post-war thing and it seemed pretty cool. And we don't even have that anymore, but it was better for the working class. And the people around me are educated and awful and seem self-interested. I'm going to respond to some of these comments in a minute. And it's a shock of realization, but it still assumes that everyone is like you. So I'm going to comment on this because I study anthropology and I think this is actually correct, and I haven't gotten to that point yet. Rationality is predicated on filtering an infinite array of information, and that, in that sense, it's a relevant detail. It's impossible to live without some form of ideology. Okay. Ideology is doing a lot of work there. I think what you're saying is it's impossible to live without a filtering worldview. The thing with Marxist use of ideology is we move between definitions without realizing it. It's the way Christians talk about God. All right? God is something that is both all-knowing and all-powerful, even though that is literally an impossibility logically. You can't be all-knowing and know what everything is going to be and be all-powerful and assume there's any agency in the world, right? Conversely, ideology is both materially produced, but we have to have it to filter information. Now, I think in the way you're using ideology, you're absolutely correct. You must have a filter to process information. There is no way as an intelligent being to deal with the flood of information coming at you. And I think this is also why AIs, and I don't think they're real intelligence. We can get into the science of that if you want. But AIs replicate the ideologies of their programmers because they have to have an ideological filter. The ideological filter literally defines their fucking terms. Now, you can take this too far, though. All right. And I can get to that in a minute because it makes ideology sound like it emerges from nothing and dominates everything. And it runs a dynamic, the rest of the dynamic you're describing. Yes, absolutely. Monkey Rud 2108. It absolutely does. I think you're profoundly right. Ideology in the loose sense of filter upon thoughts of which way too much information. Yeah, you predicted where I was going to go. It is fundamental to intelligence. I think you're absolutely right. And this is the problem. The problem is we are presented with an infinite amount of data and an infinite complexity of data, and we have to process it in some ways. And also, now this is where my social analysis is going to add on top of that. We are social beings. We are not designed is the wrong word, but we have not, and evolved is a little bit confusing. But we have not survived as a species, as crazy monkeys who are weaker than our two closest relatives. I mean, a bonobo can bite your fingers off without even trying. It often happens that they're trying to warn a human to do something socially. Yes, negative dialectics really did change my life, and I can talk about that too. But on this parasociality thing, when you add this I am saying you have to be brilliant to believe stupid shit, actually. You know, there's study after study after study that backs up that smart people are more inclined to believe insane things because we can rationalize it. But that's humans. That's all humans. That, you know, because of our way to yeah, so upper mind and your health follow open, but that's everybody. But here the confounding factor though is not just this. The confounding factor in truth is that we need a social group. And this gets, and you know, we can talk about capitalist atomization if you want. And that's true. It absolutely is true. The fundamental truth of post-industrial life is that life is more and more atomized, and that we enjoy it. Let's be honest. This is the part of this we don't really want to talk about. We kind of like our atomization. How many of you would rather talk on your phone than engage with another person? Even if you feel good about it, it's just the dopamine hit of your phone. Like, it's something that I don't think, you know, when I talk about Christopher Lash, and there's a lot of reactionary ways to take Christopher Lash, right? I'll get to some of the other questions here, but he talks about the capitalist decline of organic community and what people miss about him and cultural narcissism and Haven in a Heartless World, his book about the family. He doesn't think you can reverse it. He does not think you can reverse the situation of the family. In fact, his argument about the family is that because we used it as an outlet, as the one place that was not political economic, it was pure relations, we put too much pressure on it to be sustainable. And so, yeah. Well, Monkey Run, it's why I study cybernetic theory. It's also some things that cut against Marx. Like Marxists love centralization, but they don't believe that brutalness exists. Which is, this is a classic Marxist definition. Ideology is how you harmonize your material self-interest with the moral positions you'd likely to hold. And I think this is true. What I would say about it, however, is that Reed seems to think you can get beyond it. But let's look at Reed's own politics. I really respect what Reed points out about the way communities have their own class dynamics, the way that there are class incentives to politicize all kinds of things, in very self-interested ways to get power within your community and outside of it, in ways that are very gross, actually, and that discourage unity. But Reed's politics ends up being a kind of reformism that ignores the economic imperatives that he otherwise talks about. The problem with most Marxist definitions of ideology is they exclude themselves. They see themselves as gnostically aware of the situation, and there isn't a way to be so. That is not to imply that change can happen, and is not to imply that we're totally subject to all these ideological fates that people, you know, are just born into ideology and they're just going to stay that way, and it's always about their self-interest. And so it's a lot more stochastic than that. But the idea that Marxism is somehow exempt from this dynamic that it describes is kind of ludicrous. I don't think you can prevent reason from becoming oppressive. And I also don't think it's good to not do reason. Like, you can be aware of your own ideology and be stuck with it. That's the crazy thing. It's just like with cognitive dissonance, right? Are knowing about confirmation bias. People who know about confirmation bias are no less likely to do confirmation bias heuristics than people who don't. And it's like my weird relationship with Hegelianism, because the one thing I like about Hegelianism is also the thing I hate about it. I'll talk about that too. It's dialectics, right? In theory, dialectics is because of the way we try to organize our thoughts, and this is where I disagree with Hegel because he ontologizes this. That the predication of the binary is often reinforcing. All right. So we posit something, and to know it, we define it against something else. We almost have to, like, you have to, the ones and zeros, or that you have to exclude something for something to be differentiated in terms of no. This monkey run person, I don't normally think is here, but I'm agreeing with him today. Is ideology not just a fish that doesn't know it is in water? I mean, that's a metaphor for it, right? The thing is, knowing you're in water doesn't make you not a fish. It doesn't make you not need to fish. It doesn't make you aware of the world outside. You might know you're in water. You have no idea what's beyond that anyway. Like, the idea that you don't know it just makes it effective, but like it doesn't need that. There's a way in which the Marxist can convince himself or herself, but mostly, unfortunately, and media spears himself, that they are beyond the dynamics in which they speak. Let me give you the simplest front from raising. I always talk about the whole like failed political movements thing that I quote Pat Buchanan of all people on. That they when a political movement can't take power, it matures into a business and turns into a grift, right? But the reason why is actually quite complicated, and it's easy to be cynical about, but it's also quite natural. I explained this a little bit when I was talking to Joe Payne. I don't even blame people for this. You look at the way that you need resources to promote your consciousness raising project so that you can do something about it. But that incentivizes different things. I warned Doug Lane many years ago, and people don't know Doug Lane is a guy I work with at Zero Books. This is way before Zero. And I told him, if we ever start making money from what we do on the left, we're going to have a hard time, A, with actually wanting to win, but B, even more so, with actually seeing what our own incentives are. All right. And what are our incentives? What are our incentives, really? When we really think about them. Like, if you're a media Marxist, what are your incentives? Well, your incentives are to get along, to get people on your show, to always be able to have a constant stream of guests, and you can't be hostile to your guests. You can kind of, you can do subtle things, but if you really go after your guest, you're breaking a social bond, and it is actually a dick thing to do. All right? They are giving you time. You have to reciprocate it by giving them something back. And particularly if you're making money off of it. It's hard. It's very hard. Doug Lane and I used to talk about this all the time. Fin Absolute Demont. I don't even know. You guys have all changed your names. And it's it's something that it drives. It's really hard to be honest, but also to be fair. All right, because I'm going to also say this: there are people with shitty political opinions that I'm not going to be mean to because they're decent people. They're very decent people. And there are people with good political opinions who are horrible shit stains on humanity. It doesn't work out in a nice, even way. I always think about, like, on parasocial stuff and sociality, like the way leftists interact with, I'm going to be frank, the way leftists interact with a lot of women, or where leftist men interact with a lot of women, but it's not just that, actually. It's a little bit broader than this. I'm not actually attacking just leftist men here. Has a element of, desperation that leads people to miss sociological cues, and it makes friendship and peerage very hard, where being a superficial ally becomes very easy. But relationships, actual relationships, and I don't mean like sexual relationships or anything like that, but like relationships where people hold each other accountable and can do so because a relationship is meaningful. People are okay. Here's the thing: is people are ambitious and self-interested, but that's a simpleton's worldview. That's populism. All right. This is actually what leads populism astray a lot of the time. People are ambitious and self-interested, and they also need connection. And if you don't add that last part, nothing makes sense. A lot of the weirder, irrational things that like rich people will occasionally do, and I don't just like when they're like weirdly altruistic or something, is based off that third category that we don't take advantage of. I have a very complicated relationship. I'm going to tell a personal story that I maybe shouldn't. As a Marxist, when I was in Egypt, I had this kind of gold star insurance that was from Britain, but they were like not paying out on any of my now ex-wife's cancer treatment. They were supposed to, but they were finding every technical way to get out of it, and there was no way to do anything about it. Nothing could be done about it. Absolutely nothing. I couldn't do anything. I would just fret. And I couldn't even do the paperwork for my wife because of the way they required her to do it. And this weird, and I don't want to essentialize here because you can essentialize people's cultures in ways that are just racist. But my boss, my immediate boss, told my big overlord boss, who was a Lebanese man, that this was happening. Now, I don't know the real motivations for my boss to step in. Maybe it really was altruism. Maybe it was a sense that, like, these are my employees and they're my vassals and only I can fuck with them. I don't know. Like, I don't want to, like, in fact, both things could even be true. But he did something, and the insurance company got in line overnight. Now, when I tell you this, I need you to know the scale of money we're talking about here. Because in America, there are certain cancer medications that are life-saving that you can get, particularly if you're younger. And my ex-wife was then only 35 years old. That are effective for cancers that normally have a 95% death rate. She had type 4 melanoma. She's now 5 years out, but this is 5 years ago. Type 4 melanoma. The Egyptian doctors who treated her refunded our money. Refunded our money because they just thought she was dead. And the doctor gave my ex-wife her diagnosis money back. Just gave it back. Just flat out. And I can also, like, this is also why I talk about how, like, me and Doug Lane used to argue about this. I'm like, capitalism works differently in different cultures because some vestigial things or differences in cultural context and difference in superstructure actually do matter. But because they were like, well, you can have her treated here because, she's going to die anyway, which is basically what they were telling me, but not her. We send her back to America, and the immunotherapy treatment was $1,000. No, I take that back. That's wrong by an order of magnitude. It was $100,000. There we go. That's what it actually was. A dose. Now with insurance, it gets knocked down to $50,000 a dose. That's what they paid for it. And they were willing to give us that price. And my boss stepped in and beat around that insurance company until they fucking paid it. And my ex-wife, to be honest, would have gotten the treatment anyway because she went to a nonprofit hospital, but she would have been in debt and I would have never come back to the United States. Okay? Now that I was already a far deep Marxist at this point. I was a deep Marxist at the end of my first marriage. I mean, I'm one of the few people I know who divorce radicalized me as opposed to made me a conservative, but there's a bunch of things that radicalized me. I tell many different stories about it actually, because when you ask me and I focus on one thing seems true at the time. When you actually look at it like in a holistic way, there's actually probably 50 different inputs that are over determining how you end up where you are. You know, I talk about my marriages and stuff, but even I'm hesitant to do that because I didn't want people to have a parasocial relationship with me. All right. I didn't want people to think that they knew me because I don't owe them anything. And because of that, I don't have an equal footing with them. And it's like how I would always tell my students this, you know, I care about you. I love you. You're not my friend. Right? We'll get to the seriousness of war. You're not my friend because we don't have enough equal power for you to be my friend. You know, I have a relationship, a responsibility to you. We cannot be social equals right now. You can be in the future. I am friends with former students, and I'll even tell my students that, but not when, you know, they're actually in my care. I've also had to tell people as parents that, you know, you can be friends with your kids when they don't need you, but maybe being friends with your kids when they do is selfish. You know, and these are hard things to deal with because they fuck people like doing streaming game theory. I kind of am in a way. And I've been thinking about this a lot because when I came in tonight, I came very frustrated because I was mad. I was mad at myself. I was mad at other people. Mad at myself because sometimes I can confuse myself into thinking that I am having an effect by doing all this critical pedagogy on a large swath of people. And I realized that, like, there are people who I've never met who know my name and mention me, but there's also a million, probably about a, you know, 200 or 300, maybe. No, let's be fair. Let's talk about there's 5 billion people or more who have no. Let's be honest. There's probably 7 billion people who have no idea I exist. And that's fine, actually. That's okay. It's, you know, every now and then I'm driven to like try to push this out, try to change more minds. Right. And I do think that those of us who do left media, if we do it honestly, we can have a positive effect. But you almost always have to undercut yourself because the temptation is always there. You need guests. You need friends. You need allies. You need to instrumentally use people. What if you like porn? But there's nothing wrong with liking porn and podcasts. Just know what it is. Know what it is. You know, like, I'm not trying. This is the thing. I'm not trying to shame you into this. I'm actually saying I am guilty of this too. I find myself like I have an opponent. Like I don't do hostile interviews. I have people ask me to do hostile interviews all the time. You know why I don't do it? One, I think it's morally a shitty thing to do. I think it's shitty to invite someone on to make them feel like they're safe and then to go after them. You should just let them know that you don't like agree with them flat out. And I don't say that. I don't also do interviews with just people I agree with. Okay, like I don't. For one thing, who actually agrees with everything I say? Nobody. And if you think you do, you don't. I promise. Yeah, that is all I'm saying here. Is have a sober analysis of who you are. Like I disagree with people on China. I disagree with people on the nature of the state. That sometimes is a major that's one of the things where I get really mad. I disagree with people on, but I also disagree with people on anti-China policies. I say I don't debate fascists though. I know some. I mean, I'm not necessarily proud of that, but I know some. If I'm honest, many people in our orbit have defected to not just conservatism, which I actually it disheartens me that I don't find that particularly abnormal. Unfortunately, I um I my own opinions on things like, for example, state interaction. If you were to really ask me, one, you shouldn't debate it. Most debate is just rhetoric. The point of debate, like when someone believes that they're actually, winning out through logic and skills in a debate, what are they doing? Because so much of a debate tactics is just pure rhetoric, and it has no relationship to truth whatsoever. It doesn't even have much relationship to logic. And people who think it does, they end up spinning their wheels on just weird shit. I'm not going to call out names, but we all know people who do it. People can debate about fascism. Here's the thing. We project onto all kinds of demographics of people because we have to. To understand the working class, we have to project about the collective worker, and we have to come up with an idea of what they are. And that idea is almost always wrong. What I try to push back on, for example, and like I don't take a stand. Oh, debate is just PMC battle rap. Oh, you have to bring up the PNC, Jason. You're just stabbing me. But let's ask ourselves a couple of real questions, right? Like, I remember I read in a letter on my Patreon only, and maybe one day I should make it public. I was talking with my friend Mark Rainey, that you can't win over, and they were talking about trying to win over Lassallians, not fascists, but you don't aim for the ideologues, you aim for the people the ideologues are aiming for. All right, you're not going to win over the ideologues. Generally, they might come over. Okay, now I say that because you're talking to a person who was. I would not say that that I ever met the definition of fascist, but I was hands down a paleo-conservative reactionary. All right. My differences with the paleo-conservatives, was that I had a multiracial family, so I couldn't really buy into their racial shit, and I didn't notice it. It became something that I just couldn't deny anymore. Like, the nationalism regarded about um the nationalism in regards to that, like its inherent racialization in the modern world was something I could not deny. But when I was a paleoconservative, I thought, like, of course I'm not racist. Of course. Because my idea of nationhood did incorporate everybody who got brought over here, and whether, it was awful, the whole settler colonial project. And even when I was a paleoconservative, I thought it was a settler colonial project. I didn't use those terms, but I was like, the land was stolen. But it's a fact. It's a fact of history. There's nothing to be done about that. And there are some times where I wish Marxists would actually look at that and, like, look at how we fix problems now, as opposed to, like, trying to get justice for the past, because justice for the past is effectively impossible. Would you call a militant paleocon? Starts with an F. Well, that's what happens, right? Like, if you get radicalized, where do you go in that milieu? You become a rabid nationalist? Do you become a third wayist? Do you become a third positionist? All right. I remember reading about Francis Jacques from people around me, and it was, like, horrifying, but I thought they were on my side. Well, this is a thing. This is another thing that I think people have to look at. I was talking to Esri today. We had a phone call because Esri was concerned about my psychological health, and maybe she should be, frankly. There are times that I am. Yeah. I had all sorts of. Oh boy. Chris Hedges makes this vein right here. Right here pop out of my head. Because not because he's wrong. Actually, Chris Hedges is kind of brilliant, but then he dips into this, like, moralistic reactionarism. And he thinks that you can kind of political will your way out of that. And he always has. First, he thought it was, like, by being like the good guys against the black people in the Democratic Party, and now he's realized that was nonsense. And he's realizing, like, you need something like a broad-based social party that's kind of populist. But he's recapitulating the Green Party from Camejo again. So you have to deal with those limitations. So, like, he makes that vein pop out of my head because he's so close to correct, and he has been for so long. War is a Force that Gives Us Meaning, American Fascism, which was about evangelicalism, even though by the time he's writing it really wasn't a problem anymore. So it's funny, guys, because I always forget that you guys haven't been at this milieu for 20 fucking years, right? And I labored in this shit, and I say labored kind of ironically. I was a person reading books and trying to organize a graduate student union and this, that, and the other. When I was, like, 25, and I had this weird period. I always make it seem like there's a clear flash of light, like, and I became a Marxist. And when I really look back, if I'm really honest, there was this battle between three tendencies in my head, some of which reflects my class position, actually, which is because Marxism, as I experienced it, particularly in college, was not very appealing to me as a working class person, and my family. You know how many people make me want to pop a blood vessel? Like, that more reflects me, guys, than Hedges. But my point about Hedges stands is that I think he's so almost there. What he gets a lot of Marxists doing is you have to meet people where they are. What he doesn't get, it's actually the same thing a lot of Marxists don't get, is that is that if I had a list of people who won't come on my show, Jason, you get people I don't get. Is that there's a certain amount of like belief in principle and nihilism about fact that you kind of have to have, and you have to be willing to in my mind to go, I believe in this principle. I know I can't let it actually affect my analysis, because if I let it affect my analysis, my ability to actually make this principle an enactable thing becomes harder and harder to do. And yet it's impossible not to let it affect your analysis, right? You're constantly in this disconnect where you're like saying to yourself, that you're saying to yourself, on one hand, that everything I believe might be wrong, and yet I must persist anyway, and yet also, and it's not easy to do. It really messes with your sense of self. I don't even necessarily think it's healthy. But what I see as these social incentives and these parasocial relationships, and let me get back to where I started, right? Is that there's an incentive to double down on these claims. And I do it too. Like there are things that I will absolutely double down on the claim on. One is like I have a distrust of state socialism, like just inherently, it's a thing. And I have reasons for it that are well thought out that could be utterly bullshit. I don't think they're bullshit. I think I have good Marxist reasons for why I believe what I believe. There's also reasons why I'm not an anarchist, even though you wouldn't know that from the way I talk about the state and the class nature of the state and what the state does and how it's inherent to the form. I mean, after all, the state is a group of armed men that comes into being to protect surplus, and I'm not even talking about capitalism here. Just that's what states do. And it implies by that definition that there's a division of labor that is permanent and inherited in some way, or at least there's a special exemption to it, and it is not divided socially, right? Because if you have a permanent standing army, for example, you have a permanent group of people that are effectively a class. It might not be a capitalist class relation, it could be all kinds of things. But the modern state, because it is not dependent on land production, is dependent on all kinds of other stuff. The ability, if not the ability to collect revenue, is the ability to compel labor through currencies, is dependent on capital. There could be other class forms of states. That's totally true. And when Engels and Lenin talk about the withering away of the state, it's because like there might need to be a need for protective suppression, blah 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 blah. I can go back over the arguments. There's also some stuff that I think is fundamentally disingenuous about these arguments, but I actually do think, for example, when Lenin says that Pannekoek was absolutely right about the state, which he says in chapter 5 of State and Revolution, people need to take that more seriously, because he said it against Kautsky. Lenin said it. Pannekoek was right against Kautsky. Yeah. Well, on authority is a deviant text. So. One thing you could say about Engels's interventions is Engels's writings from that time period are kind of at odds with themselves, because if you read his critique of the Erfurt program, it's actually hard to square with on authority. And a lot of people don't read this stuff. And they want to believe that everybody had a perfectly well-formed opinion that was coherent throughout the entirety of their writing period, or that there's like clear, distinct epistemological breaks or something. And that's not how these people work. It's not how I work. It's not how you work. I think the attack on Engels is unfair frankly, because the person who actually states the stuff about the state the most clearly is Ingalls in his critique of the Erfurt program, which he signs on to the Erfurt program, right? But he has a strong critique about like the nature of the state, talking about communism as opposed to nationalism or socialism. And that's not because he disagrees with socialism or has a status theory. I don't mention she who will not be named. The thing is, we live in a world with states, and that's what it is. If states are inherent class, that's what they are. You have to navigate that somehow. To say that you can just abolish it overnight, without dealing with the fact that there are all these other social functions beyond the class, the class oppression of the state that it actually serves administratively, and that there are not clear immediate alternatives to it, does have to be dealt with. Don't bring that which is on Twitter into the real world. But this is the thing. COVID in particular has been like a fever dream. All right. QAnon isn't the only people who've been projecting onto the world off of their social media isolation all kinds of increasingly crazy things. We do it too. We like to laugh at the Q people. We like to be afraid of the alt-rightists who have done this to themselves. But we don't want to look at the fact that we have the same fucking incentives as they do. I've read, God, I haven't thought about The Art of Loving in 20 fucking years. Actually, it's not true. In 12 years. I wrote about it when I was in Korea and going through my first divorce. And other than, I thought it was pretty good, actually, except for there's a lot of psychoanalytic anti-gay stuff in there that needs to be filtered out. The whole, like, homosexuality is necessarily a form of narcissism. Why? Yeah. We can't believe that we are exempt from the social milieu in which we exist in. That's true for parasocial relationships. That's true for ideology. That's true for rationality. That's true for any of this. Right? The basic point of my point here and why I'm so frustrated. And yet, I don't know that knowing that is psychologically helpful or healthy. I avoid discussions on human agency because pretending it doesn't exist makes hope easier. Well, human agency is complicated. It's an emergent phenomenon. All right. I actually do think countercausal free will in its ultimate sense, and to get super fucking nerdy philosophical, is self-contradictory. However, I also think like pretending that that causation works like Newtonian physics isn't even backed up in physics. Like agency is an emergent phenomenon, just like consciousness is an emergent phenomenon. And people are like, aren't you a compatibilist? Yeah, I am a compatibilist, actually. Like, but if you really believe in hyperdetermination, then you're not actually a compatibilist. You're an illusionariist. You believe that the illusion of compatibility makes it real or something. I've really had like some head spinning debates on just insisting people actually be consistent on this point. I log off all the time, guys. I don't live my life online. I have, in fact, one of the unfortunate things about COVID for me is that, as a teacher, years and years of having to be a control freak were beginning to wear me down. And you want to talk about the structure of institutions that have nothing to do even with the purpose of the institution. If you are a teacher, When people say teachers are cops, and there's a superficial sense in which that's utterly bullshit. Like, no, they're not. Like, they're not enforcing the will of the state in that way, but they have to maintain compliance just to keep that many people in a fucking room together when their hormones are raging and they're away from any other social connection, and it's a really unnatural situation. The state can easily use that, right? But it is what it is. I mean, like, it's something that you have to be aware of. And I found, weirdly, during COVID, that online education, which I think works for about a third of the population. All right, I got numbers to even back this up. But I didn't have to be a control freak anymore. And I started liking my job, which is education, and I'm good at it. But the converse, the flip side of that is that, I don't have, my social interactions became more and more limited. And I found during the beginning of the COVID crisis that I was like hyper online again for the first time since I was abroad. There were time periods in my life, particularly when I was single, where I was hyper online, and I would use Facebook as a way to connect to my home culture. All right. And I know people don't understand this about me, and they forget it sometimes, but during almost the entirety of during all but 1 year, a year and a half of the Obama administration, I was not in the United States. The entire cultural changes that we had around gender happened when I was not here. When I was abroad, I held some kind of retrograde opinions on it. I've talked to people about it, but partly because it was foreign to me. It just seemed like out of nowhere. Yes, I had known trans people before, I left, but the whole debate and discussion and way of conceptualizing gender and sexuality was actually a major shift that we don't always acknowledge as a major shift, because when I left, we were still talking about, people being genetically gay. There's a whole lot of commentary coming here, so I knew that. I remember my first school shooter drill after 8 years out of the classroom. I didn't know how much to do it because we didn't do those in 2010. The police came through and when I have to do home shooter drills, and okay, so a little bit more of my background, way, way back in my past, like 20 years ago, I was a prison guard briefly. My mom was a prison nurse, so I was it was a job I could get in college. I could study at night. I didn't do it for forever. I did it for 9 months, and it made me even as a paleo conservative. You can actually maybe you can find it in the way back machine. Me as a conservative arguing that, like, caning people, which I thought was barbaric, was more humane than prisons. And I said this as a conservative. That and I also was anti-death penalty for the most part. I have complicated opinions on that, but. So that, I came out of that situation, right? But I remember some people asked me, and my students will ask me what I think about school shooter drills, or in Utah, we can concealed carry as teachers, even though I can't break up a fight. And I'm not making that up. All right. I have to be specially trained to break up a fight, and licensed to do it by the state of Utah for indemnity reasons. But I can carry a gun on campus as long as it's concealed as a teacher as much as I want. It's crazy. And that's been true in Utah for 6 or 7 years. What's funny about that is both the right and the left predictions have been utterly wrong. Like, they've both been wrong about, like, the left people say, oh, it leads to teachers shooting kids. We haven't had one instance of that. What has led to is teachers shooting their own feet off. But they would ask me about this, what I would do in that situation. And I was like, well, look, I think statistically speaking, there are a bajillion other things that you should be more worried about than school shooters. Even though there's been an uptick and an increase, they are statistically super fucking rare. Right. And I would tell my kids this. And I would also say, I don't like the fact we're traumatized. And they would be traumatized. They would be traumatized by those damn school shooter drills. And it reminded me of being a prison guard. Really did. and they would come to me because, my kids would know that, because I would say things about guns. I personally don't carry a gun anymore. I don't own a gun anymore. But I am trained. I know how to use everything from, a 22 to a bolt action. And I'm also trained in judo. So so just so you know, I used to be really into fighting. I miss fighting, actually. I think sometimes I think a lot of my aggression would probably go away if I could just punch someone in the face, and in a way that was not meant to hurt them. I've actually thought about picking up boxing again. We've seen this actually a lot more. When I was in high school, this was in the 90s. We already had, before people forget that we had like inner city schools and schools that were of color. And my school was not inner city, but it was 50-50 on the racial scale. It was 50%. I think it was 40% black, like 11% other. And literally at the time it was designated as other because like the way they took stats to comply with the American Civil Rights Act was black, white, are not, which is crazy. The school shooter drills will traumatize some kids because they actually believe it's a possibility. But the more likely danger is that stuff happening outside of school, immediately outside of school, with guns, or actually even without guns, and it predates the school shooter, epidemic in quotation marks. Columbine, if you actually, like, most liberal stats, and this actually drives me up the wall, start the talk about school shootings with Columbine, and they bracket out the 70s and the 80s. Do you know why they bracket out the 70s and the 80s? Because school shootings that were gang related, related to gang tensions, were actually super common. They just were not random. And you started seeing the beginning of the whole security state schools around that time in urban schools. And even in my school, when I was in high school, there was an incident where 3 kids came into the school, they busted a bottle, and they shanked a kid in the hall. Gang violence peaked in the early 90s. It's general consensus is it's tied into deindustrialization. It wasn't like the drug trade was new or anything like that. That, in already deracinated communities, and it was not as, we because we've been given racist image, we imagined it was predominantly black. It was absolutely not. It was poor communities that were racially organized generally. There were white gangs, and lots of them actually where I lived. It happened. Yeah, Kenzo, you're absolutely right. Gang-related school shootings aren't part of the moral panic of urban violence, so no one talks about it. It's hard, right? Yeah, that happens probably more. We also had students who'd steal guns and not act, and would do it for other reasons, and then the school would freak out, go into lockdown. That actually really happened at a school I worked at. But anyway, the kids would ask me if I would carry, and what I would do. And one, I tell them, even just logically, do you want to be the only adult holding a gun when the cops come in? Like, if there's been a shooting, do you not understand what that would do? I'm not even talking about like the insanity of police violence and all the, that after yourself and then your lover, the third most likely person to kill you is a cop, just statistically. The first most likely person to kill you is yourself. The second most likely person to kill you is someone in your immediate family, particularly if you're a woman, but that's true for everybody. And the third most likely person to kill you is a police officer. So, like, it's, just pointing that out. But in Western Europe by a lot, it is still rare, and that murder rates here are in the median for the developed world. They're far worse than Europe and East Asia, but they're far better than Russia, and even parts of the UK. Well, what's funny thing about schools and shooting drills is they actually remind me of like the tornado and nuclear bomb drills. And I'm old enough that we did have, like, I was in the South, but we still did them. They'd have you, like, get under your desk for a bomb, which is really absurd. Anyway, we started off talking about other things, and I got really distracted by all of your comments. Well, anytime that you have more guns, there's going to be more shootings. But it doesn't necessarily correlate to all kinds of other stuff. I mean, like, my opinion on gun control is really, really complicated, actually. But I can tell you that Mexico and Sweden have effectively the same gun laws, and the laws aren't the biggest determinant factor. Just saying. I lived in, and I say this as a person, I don't carry a gun, and I refuse to carry a gun unless I absolutely have to, because I think if you carry a gun, you have to be willing to kill people. And I'm not a pacifist. I do think there's moments where that's absolutely justified. And I also tell people that they should train on weapons. I tell people, everyone I know, that you should know how to use weapons. Like, you should know how to protect yourself. I don't think necessarily you should own a gun. And I know it's a complicated thing. I think, like, if you were in the moment where you need to, then you need to. And this is, to me, this is not me being normative. I'm actually, like, I think a lot of gun control stuff is really naive. But I think personally, like, if you are willing to wield a deadly weapon, you have to be willing to say, I am willing to kill someone. And there's got to be a reason that you're willing to do it. And, I'm willing to go into militia training and all this other stuff. I totally, like, you don't have a problem with that, actually, at all. But I don't carry a gun because I'm not willing to like vigilante go into this, Yes, there's socialist gun clubs. Yes, there's this, that, and the other. I will say a lot of what I've seen around some of the socialists talk about guns, and it's recapitulated toxic gun culture. And I say this, and again, when I talk about toxic gun culture, I don't think gun control is really a good answer to most of the problems around violence in America. I think that's a false answer. Oh God, all students should open carry. Oh boy. Yeah. Also, yes, if you suffer from mental health diseases, it is dangerous to own a gun. There are many things, actually, that we need to be more honest about mental health and people engaging in it. But I don't want people to think that, like, you shouldn't be trained in this stuff and you shouldn't care about this stuff. I just also think you have to weigh out your own personal choice on this. And I think, if you wielding a gun in a militia is very different than just having a fucking mini arsenal that you're never going to be even able to use at once because you're part of the great overproduction of weaponry in America. All right. Well, thank you for joining me on this rare. I don't do these as much anymore because I have a day job. Actually, yeah, everyone should know how to shoot a rifle. The question is, should you own one? And those are actually separate questions. And it's a calculus I think everyone has to make for themselves. I don't have a clear answer for people on this. But I do know when people start doing like, I need 5 AR-15s, I kind of laugh at them. Or when they go to a protest, the AR-15 as if that is the smartest tactical weapon to carry. Like, it's the easiest to use, but it's ugh. Anyway. Hi everybody. It's a late night for me. I need to do some. Here's the funny thing about this. I was trying to sit down and write stuff for my creative writing class, and I just couldn't sit and do it. Like I just couldn't do it tonight. Teaching a high school creative writing class online, which is much harder than most things I do, as far as like thinking about how to do it effectively and in a way that means something for kids, right? I should do more of these more often. Yeah, maybe. The thing is, though, there's a parasociality that I worry about, and I mentioned this even in the thread. This can give you a false sense of intimacy with me and a false sense of like peerage. And it's not because I think I'm better than any of you. Like, in fact, I'm probably worse. Putting that out there. But it's more that I know that the relationship is not truly reciprocal. And I have to be honest about what that means for myself. It's the truth, and it's something we have to do. It's something we have to look at. Really look at when we start forming relationships with people. But I don't want to be like one of those people who say, "Oh, there's no such thing as a real internet relationship," because that's not true. It's absolutely not true. What matters is that it's reciprocal. Reciprocality, what that actually means, and that there's a relationship of both benefit, responsibility, and care that goes both ways. And if it doesn't go both ways, then it's parasocial and not social. I'm not saying that the technological mediation inherently means that you don't have any social relationships with the people you meet online. That's not true. Like that's some Luddite nonsense, actually. But you do have to look about the reciprocity personally. Yeah, you're not my friend because you watch the Twitch streams I produce. Yeah, exactly. And I think honestly, there's a lot of like sad. If you want to get into like stuff I mentioned earlier, this creates all kinds of weird gender and personal dynamics, and people not meaning to be creeps, and people who do mean to be creeps and hide with the people who don't mean to be creeps. And then you have people who divest so much of themselves into their online persona that it destroys their actual IRL relationships. And I've seen it over and over and over again. How many overexposed Twitch streamers and YouTubers have destroyed their marriage, for example? Lost a girlfriend because of bullshit and turning their bullshit into public consumption. Yeah. Someone's throwing Gaelic at me. God, it's the Irish and the Swedes, except for Tom O'Brien, who I just yell at all the time. I really need to be nicer to Tom. He gets way more of my abuse than his Irish ass deserves. He already has the English to contend with. Why should he deal with the Americans, right? That's probably ethnicist in some way, and I'm sorry. But, you know, the ego pool is toxic. It really is. Tom is one of the most honest cranks I've ever met, and I actually mean that in um in the best possible way. Because the man isn't trying to turn himself into a guru, and he really does have he really does like think he can be wrong. He also comes with like weird hybridizations of stuff that I don't even understand how he reconciles it. And he often doesn't admit totally when he changes his mind unless you really make him. But he's honest. He's very honest. And I wish I had more people. I mean, I wish I knew more people like that on the internet left who were just pathologically self-doubting. I mean, he believes what he believes, and some of it, some of it I don't. But the same thing is true about me. It's gay league. It's Scottish. Damn you. See, I betray my Celtic roots that I barely have because I've been in America for too long. I've actually never been to the stupid Isles, the dangly bits off Asia, as I like to call them. I've spent a lot of time in mainland Europe. Well, by a lot, I mean like the equivalent of like a year. Yeah, I'm not going to talk shit about Tom except to his face. When I yelled at him on the stream, God, I should stop doing that. I really actually like Tom. All right. Good night. Good night.